to the first of this new Oxford Martin School series of events on the Dasgupta Review on the Economics of Biodiversity. My name's Cameron Hepburn. I'm Professor of Environmental Economics and Director of the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. And to kick off this event series, we have none other than Professor Sir Partha himself, the author, or perhaps I should say lead author, because it was a team effort. I'm sure he's the first to say, but certainly the lead intellect and the brains and the engine behind what is a meaty 604-page review. So welcome, Partha. It's a particular pleasure for us to have you with us here, in Oxford digitally. Partha was reminding me that it is almost 2 years to the day. It was the 16th of May, 2019, when we invited Partha to come to Oxford to set out his initial thinking on what such a review could contain. And of course, when you're thinking about your research agenda, it evolves and changes and grows. And we were just reminiscing, or at least reflecting on the fact that actually what has emerged is, really a hugely substantial body of work, a rethinking in some ways of economics with an awful lot of valuable textbook material in here too. So students out there, you might want to read the review very closely. Now, for many of you, Sir Partha will need no introduction. He holds a kind of guru-like status, I hope you won't mind me saying, within economics. There'll be people here who've read an awful lot of what you've written, but there'll be people here who don't have a kind of dog-eared copy of Dasgupta and here with sticky yellow notes all over it. So let me just do a quick introduction. So Partha was appointed Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge in 1985, served as chairman of the faculty from 1997 to 2001, and he's won awards and prizes too numerous to list, including, of course, his knighthood. Research-wise, perhaps more importantly than the prizes and the accolades, the intellectual contribution has been vast. Partha's PhD thesis in '68 was centered on economic growth and population. And in a way, the nice thing about this body of work is that it comes back round to those big questions, actually. And if you're obsessing about how many children to have, or if you're still wondering whether having 3 was okay by the planet, in my case, reading Partha is perhaps not likely to resolve all of your inner demons, but it'll make you realize there are more ethical and social dimensions to the question than you previously thought. His work has covered welfare, development economics, technological change, and of course, environmental and resource economics. And I might, in passing note, work on the theory of games as well. I've taught some of his work on the de Condorcet paradox, used and nicely applied to Brexit, actually, in recent years. So we're delighted, Partha, to have you here. It's a great distinction. And in fact, of all of your distinctions, I'm going to finish by saying perhaps your most significant distinction is that you've had the excellent taste to marry a psychotherapist, as I have too. So we're going to get on to, this is not a big formal lecture. Partha insisted that you didn't want to listen to him drone on. I think, we might have disagreed on that point. But we're going to make it very engaged. And so there's a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. So do type in questions as they appear to you. But how I wanted to start was just to say, we'll set out what I thought, in some ways, the most important messages of the review have been, and check in with Sir Partha himself and see what he thinks. So if I were to highlight 6 messages, the first is, and these are really significant, we are in an extinction event currently. It may not feel that way in the human lifespan, but when you look at the data on a geological timescale, we're currently in an extinction event, and we need to kind of wake up to that. Secondly, it's because our demands on nature far exceed the supply of nature, speaking as economists. And so our demand needs to fall, or supply needs to increase. Thirdly, the key failure, the failure to understand this, the failure to do something about it, a key failure here is institutional. And doing more of the same sort of things in the hope that we're going to solve this problem, or this series of related environmental biodiversity related problems, actually won't work. We need some quite radical interventions at this stage. Fourthly, a key plank is that we need to start getting prices into nature. We need to value nature properly. Now, this is a hotly contested, highly emotive and debated area on ethical grounds, on pragmatic grounds. I'm sure there'll be questions about it, and we'll discuss it together over the course of the next hour. And then lastly, I'm going to say that one of the things I took away from the review is that the prices that we would hope to get that are politically feasible probably won't be enough. And indeed, there are other externalities here, other problems, market failures that need to be addressed. And what we're going to need to do, and there's no one better than Partha to actually think this through, is to recognize the social nature of our preferences and understand how those preferences can be shifted towards more environmentally friendly kinds of preference or goals. And we also need to rethink our technological and innovation systems so that we get more nature-friendly innovation. So it's not just pricing, it's preferences as well, and innovation, recognizing, of course, that all three of those are connected. So, Partha, I think that's enough from me. That's what I took away in terms of the high-level key messages. Do you think that's a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it is a fair summary. That's a very good one, more than fair.
And which of them do you think, in terms of if you had a magic wand and you could wave it and just say, I want these few things to change, because if it is a fair summary, we're in an extinction event, what we've done isn't enough. What has to happen from here?
Well, I think just a multiplicity of things, and they have to be rooted from very local items, individual decisions, small communities, villages, right? And then up through to the national governments and international institutions as well. And I've tried to show how that can be done. It has to hang together. We're looking at a multiplicity of problems operating at different scales and different speed. So there are local, regional, and so forth, up to the top. So we need a lot. So what I've tried to do is essentially to study the inequality between demand and supply, the one which you articulated a minute ago, and decompose the demand into the factors that make for it. And on the right-hand side, that is of the inequality, the supply side, as the goods and services that the biosphere produces for us and we enjoy. And the decomposition tells me the kind of parameters that need to be shifted. And of course, as you know, the way I decomposed it, borrowing from the work of natural scientists, a population, per capita use of nature, production of goods and services, and a critical thing, an efficiency parameter, a parameter which records the efficiency with which we convert nature's goods and services into final products. And so, of course, the rest of the review picks on each of the items and sees how to think about them, what kind of policies could be generated, what changes in our belief are required and our practices in order to push down the demand or pulling down the demand as you were suggesting. And of course, more on the technological side would be the right-hand side of supply, investment in nature and so forth. So another way of putting it, to expand on it, is to say that in the Economics of Biodiversity, although that's the title, it's really not the subject. Pretty much a few months after I started working on it, I realized that what I was grappling with was the economics of the entire biosphere. Now, that's the ultimate subject to study. So that's what it is. Biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. It's not the ecosystem itself. It's a characteristic of it, a feature of it. So what we don't have in the economics of in the review is a simple measure, like say carbon concentration in the atmosphere. You might think I would have said, let's start with biomass, which is, after all, carbon content of some material that you see. But we don't go that route. Instead, the basic building blocks are ecosystems. And of course, they range in size and you name it, it's a contextual thing. And the goods and services that the processes that underlie the ecosystem produces. So that's where it's the heart of the matter. And it's very much like, the way economists would think of it. There are stocks of capital. These are ecosystems. They produce goods and services, flows. These are durable goods, but they can be depreciated. So you get a picture of how you might be able to influence both the demand, reduce the demand, and increase the supply.
And how long do you think we have before we really have to get on top of this challenge of reducing demand on nature and on ecosystems and increasing supply? I mean, how long is it before we start to see people really suffering the consequences of the degradation of nature and biodiversity losses? Or would you say we're already there, we're already seeing it?
Well, at one level, of course, we've been seeing it at a small scale level for a long time. Villages go under in Africa, South Asia, Latin America. So much of the distress migration we see is arising because their local ecosystems got degraded to the point where they can't support themselves. And they try and move, but the neighbors don't want them either because they also are poor. They can't be welcoming. So in some sense, we've seen the effects of biodiversity loss, if you want to put it that way. I would say ecosystem productivity loss, not so much biodiversity loss, but we've seen that. And we have to think now, move up, scale it up, and see what might lie ahead for the global community. Okay. Of course, the speed varies. There are many, many processes at work. Climate regulation is only one of the many services that nature provides. Nitrogen fixation is one, decomposition of waste is another, pollination is a fourth, and so forth. The multitude of those. They're all working in tandem at different speeds, and they are interconnected, like any good capital, model of economics would have it. These are interconnected. But the critical thing, in my judgment, is that what I learned from the sciences is that they are complementary to one another. They're not substitutes. And that comes to the point you just now made, which is how close are we to a problem, a global problem? And it's hard, of course, I can't say whether it won't be tomorrow, it won't be in 5 years' time, it won't be in 10 years' time, but unraveling can take place slowly, but parts of the structure, superstructure, fracture. We are seeing aspects of it in climate because that's more visible, experienceable. But biodiversity loss, same thing's happening there too. The wetlands get degraded, the coastal fisheries get degraded, there are dead zones. Those are all symptoms of fractures of our system. So, it's not a question of the whole humanity going under, but this is a crisis situation. There's no question about it. The gap between demand and supply is increasing. It's large already. It's increasing, and this is coming from a variety of studies of earth sciences, ecological sciences, environmental sciences, and a few contributions by economists as well. They're all converging to the understanding that there is a big gap and it's increasing. And this can't go on because these systems are very nonlinear. So the fracturing that takes place, I'm using the word fracture advisedly because these are nonlinear systems. So you can shift, so some subparts will shift to a different regime. Yep. Like a dead zone is an example of that. A large dead zone in, say, in the Gulf of Mexico. That's what it is. So it's something we ought to attend to as fast as possible, in my judgment. And what does that mean? And I'll complete this response with the thought that the review essentially ends by suggesting that it can only be done if we citizens engage with the issue. It's no good simply saying, it's the government's job. It's not their job. Their job is to respond to us And unless we get excited about it and feel concerned about our descendants, nothing will happen. Now, if only we could, if you think of 2 weeks ago when there was the suggestion of a European league, football league, and if you saw the speed with which citizens responded to it, with such ferocity that extremely rich people were stymied within 2 days. If only we could channel that kind of emotional energy to a problem which really is serious, then of course we would make some progress.
And do you think one of the reasons that this is so difficult, that we don't see European Super League sort of passion aroused and action taken, is that I hate to use the boiling frog metaphor, not least because it's wrong. I gather frogs don't fail to jump out of increasingly warm water, but because the non-linearities in the system, at least at kind of regional and global scale, we're not quite seeing them dramatically hit us with multiple breadbasket failures and famines and so on yet. We know they're coming, but until you can see them and tangibly taste them, it's a very abstract, it's very conceptual, it's the sort of problem that appeals to a mind like yours and to mine, I dare say, precisely because it's difficult and complex, but it's not straightforward for the average football fan, perhaps, to understand. But on the other hand, everybody gets nature and they love nature and they want nature to be protected. So I'm struggling to get my head around whether, in some ways, this is a harder or an easier problem to get people excited about compared to climate change, which is very abstract. I mean, compared to protecting nature, which people do understand. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. This is a very good question. I don't know the answer to it. Your garden might be flowering very well, even while things are going awry in the Amazon basin, and they are going awry there. So you wouldn't observe it. So there's an issue of being conscious of, aware of what's going on. And as always, the effects are going to be felt unevenly. And as always, there's an iron law in economics, which is the poor get hurt first, and gradually the rich. We are the fortunate are the least affected.
So if the poor are the canaries in the mine shaft, and actually I have a colleague who says that the amphibians are the canaries in the mine shaft here, and they're not doing very well either. How do we get the rich to realize that and to observe that when the poor aren't doing so well, when the frogs are dying off, they're next? That's a hard question.
Yeah, the trouble is that because of the multiplicity of causation in social sciences, we would put the loss of ecosystem productivity right at the bottom of the heap as an explanatory device for understanding poverty. The first port of call is bad governance. That's why they're poor. Or there's a civil war. That's why but that's, of course, proximate. You might want to ask why there is a civil war. Is there a battle for resources? But we don't tend to do that. We have some simpler criteria, some proximate causes. For sure, governance is bad, but the lack of good governance may mean something deeper. And in the context of the review, of course, I focus attention on the productivity side of nature, because it's our prime asset on the basis of which farmers, fishermen, you name it, depends.
You make the point there that we've really got to think hard about and trace back to the underlying drivers of things. And in that case, the underlying drivers of poverty, and maybe pressure on nature leads to resource scarcity, which leads to conflict, which leads to civil war, which leads to poverty. But let's. I now want to pose you perhaps a deeper question. What are if nature is the underlying driver of or pressure on nature is the underlying driver of some of these social problems, what's the underlying driver of the pressure on nature? And in particular, you've spent decades thinking about population, and it's a question that is frequently asked at Oxford Martin School events, I dare say events all around the world. there are just an awful lot of us now, aren't there? Humans. I mean, we're getting on towards 8 billion. Numbers are ever rising. You've thought about this possibly harder than almost anybody else, certainly any other economist I know. How should we think about population as a driver of the pressure on nature? And what can we do? Do we want to be doing one-child policies? Do we want to be intervening in people's fertility and productivity choices? You've written an awful lot on this. It'd be lovely to hear some of your thoughts.
Well, being liberal is the final port of call is be command and control, goes without saying. All right. So there are many other preliminary things we can do, given the fact, in view of the fact that the subject is essentially ignored by economists. It's a sort of kind of a taboo subject. The only ones who put on it are demographers, and who cares about demographers? They're not influential. By the way, I work with demographers, so it's, well, what can one do about it? Well, first of all, I think one of the things that really bothers me is the fact that we economists have built models of human motivation which are egoistic. It's a supermarket view of life. We visit the supermarket and we think about what our needs are, our family needs, and we don't ask ourselves how much of our family needs have been influenced by what others are doing. Why do I go for cheese of a particular type? If that is it because my neighbor eats it, and so forth. But you see where I'm heading. Anthropologists and sociologists have made abundantly clear, with a great deal of evidence, including historians, by the way, that our preferences are socially embedded. We look around. We are influenced by what others do. So these are models of coordination.
Yeah.
You can have multiple outcomes. And some of the most successful family planning programs have made use of it, of having women come together as groups as opposed to individuals. So it's not much point in asking a person, what would your ideal family size be? A smart way of asking the question would be, what would your ideal family size be should all your neighbors have 2 children? What would your ideal family size be should all your neighbors have 3 children, and so forth? Okay, and the suggestion is it'll be a monotonically increasing response. Okay, so in that kind of a world, you're actually not giving up liberty. What you're doing is allowing an avenue where people discuss these matters in a rational way. So designing family planning programs in which it has a huge mileage if you include, first of all, to have them, and something like 220 million women in their reproductive ages do not have access to modern family planning. So it's been really a neglected field, both in government and donor countries. Less than 1% of aid from the EU goes into family planning. And the recipient countries regard family planning as a sort of they talk about empowering women, but when it comes to empowering their own bodies, so to speak, it doesn't seem to have much weight there. So that's one whole class of areas where we could really bring to bear making choices richer for people, and that would bring population down. So that's the first port of call I would go for, and it'll buy us a lot. We have experience of it. I mean, there were countries which spent money in family planning, like South Korea, Taiwan, after the Second World War. Look at them now and compare them with Philippines, for example, and you can see differences. So that's extremely important. Having said that, there is one final observation I'll make, but it doesn't color the review, largely because, as I say, the last port of call that I would go for would be command and control, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But ask ourselves the following question. If the demand exceeds supply, as in the sense that you mentioned, for the demand for goods and services, for nature's goods and services, then there are externalities associated with reproduction, just as there are externalities associated with consumption, energy consumption, and so forth. We're happy with the latter kinds of it, and we are happy to discuss the latter kind of externalities. That's what the economics of climate change is all about. But we are not very happy to think about the externalities that reproductive behavior causes for the future, for example. Okay. Now, if that is the case, if there are external diseconomies, we have a worry. There's the language of rights becomes tenuous because you're playing one person's right against another, and if there are serious external effects, then the language of rights really gets curtailed, and therefore it's not. Let me put it this way: even a good liberal could think that command and control is not completely out of bounds to think about it, because after all, we have command and control over many things in our life. I mean, you can't, you're banned from beating me up, for example. You're not allowed to do that.
Or you can relax.
You're not allowed to do that, right?
It's hard digitally anyway,
But you see what I mean? There's a heck of a lot of constraints that we are imposed on us because we voluntarily agree to forgo those liberties. And they're because of these externalities.
Well, we enjoy the right not to be punched as we walk down the street.
Exactly.
More than we want the right to be punching
people. Absolutely.
Yeah. So if we reframe this not as a kind of issue of rights, but as an issue of externalities, which then brings to bear all the classic economic tools, is a conclusion that you would want to be taxing having children?
Well, that'll be an extremely difficult question to answer because, they're poor people who are having, So I wouldn't go that route for the moment anyway. I would really go the route of technology in the sense of giving information to people, available tools for controlling their own lives. And I think all the evidence suggests you'll go a huge way if you can bring, say, for example, the fertility transition in Africa in 20 years' time rather than 40 years' time. That'll be a huge contribution to the future of Africa, if you like, for African people.
And you mentioned the importance of empowering women over their own bodies, and we speak as two men, obviously. But is it not also the case that just empowering women generally increases the opportunity cost of having children and reduces the narrow individual incentive to have children? And in addition to family planning, in addition to these other interventions, is not gender equality a key driver, perhaps, of environmental protection?
Well, that's for sure. I think so. Absolutely. Yeah. But this is a particularly cheap route. That's why I've been emphasizing it, because family planning is nothing as expensive as the education, because education requires a huge number of complementary investments, not just schoolrooms, buildings, but teachers who show up every day and children.
Well, I know there'll be many people listening in who are probably just punching the air and saying, finally, a conversation about population and the environment, because there's an awful lot of our community who think this needs to be discussed much more openly and honestly. So the review will be very welcome, and it's massively oversimplifying to say this, but I think thinking through the population dimension is one of the key things I think that we will take away from this review, and it's entirely appropriate given it's you who's written it. So, and there are already some of the questions in the Q&A more on population, which we'll get to soon. Thank you to all of you who've been submitting questions and answers. There's a slightly intimidating list in there. I actually still have 5 areas of my own to discuss with Partha, but I think I'll curtail them in the spirit of sharing the time with the wider community here. Before I do that, though, I'd just like to tap into 2 more areas, one around preferences and one around technology. Because if we think about how economists often approach environmental problem like this, where there's an externality, you seek to price it. We know that that's one of the core messages is let's price carbon for climate, let's price nature. That gets some people up in arms. If George Monbiot is tuning in, I'm sure he'd be aghast and appalled. But other people say, well, we just need to do it. But then there are those who say, well, we do need to do it, but we're not doing it very well. What are the other levers? Because it's not going to be enough pricing nature. And the other levers are shifting how people think about nature, their preferences, their consumption decisions, as well as their fertility decisions. And also thinking more deeply about the space of greener technologies, nature-friendly technologies. So in this kind of, I don't want to make it a horse race because these interventions are complementary, they're part of a portfolio, but how would you describe the balance, the roles, the respective importance of interventions around shifting people's preferences and consumption decisions, and how to do that? Part one, I guess, of the question. And part two, where are the great hopes technologically speaking? Is it feasible for us to kind of innovate our way out of some of these crises?
Well, that's tough. The answer to the last question is no. I think the idea that technology will come to our rescue is deeply flawed. Many of these problems are not technological, it's really societal. And so that has to be tackled. I'll come to this sequence of questions that are embedded in the discussion that you just had. First is, I think it's misleading to talk about pricing nature. We don't do that in the review. That's not what's, in fact, the first chapter has a rather longish box in which I say that the idea of valuing nature as a whole, the biosphere, that $33 trillion a year of service, that's what the nature is worth, is rubbish, because if there was no nature, we would be all dead. So whom are we interacting with? So that's not
a gross underestimate of infinity.
Yeah, that's a gross on. Let's do that's so. But that's what I think comes to one's mind, and when one says that if you're talking about prices in the economics of biodiversity, then that must be what you mean. You don't mean that. What you mean is changes. Now, of course, we are pricing it. Everybody ask a farmer. He or she owns a piece of land. I mean, to say that the person doesn't actually price it or doesn't recognize its price and so forth is just an affront to life. I mean, this is crazy. So the issue is not pricing. The issue is that the price is wrong, that it doesn't go with the common good. The idea in economics is to try and build a society in which the incentives individuals and communities have are consistent with the common good, bringing about the common good. That's what we mean by accounting prices or shadow prices. That's the whole idea of it, okay? So that you can decentralize, you can let people do, but they will be guided by these prices, which are another way of saying guided. Their constraints, their feasible sets will be so defined that they choose in accordance, and they choose and ends up with a sustainable world. In this case, we don't have to be very sophisticated. Closing the gap is, let's stick to the idea of closing the gap between demand and supply. Okay, so the question is, can you run through with accounting prices or shadow prices through the entire body of institutional reforms that you want to consider? The answer is no. And the reason is that you do need quantity constraints. You do need regulations. Regulations mean this, you can't do this, you can't do that. And the reason, again, comes straight from economics, really good, sophisticated economics, which is that these are nonlinear systems. So thresholds are sitting out there. There are huge uncertainty as to whether the thresholds are. That's two. And the third is that not everybody knows the same things. Some people who are living in an ecosystem know the ecosystem and downside better than the regulator. Add these three things together, and you have a nonlinear pricing system. Huge nonlinearities will mean an extreme thing in terms of quantity constraints. So protected zones, we think about them. We say, let's keep 30% of land and sea as protected. Well, that's quantity constraints. You're not allowed to go in there, right? The problem now is going to be what happens to the rest of the 70%. Suppose we do have 30%. Somehow imagine that we all agree. So we have a problem with the 70%, and that 70% is what I suppose much of the review is concerned with. So that's the second point I'd like to make. The third point is really, I think there's a huge information gap. And we've covered that a bit before when you asked as to whether the economics of biodiversity loss is something that you really cotton on to. And my guess is that it'll be a painful process. All of us have to keep on working honestly as far as possible to educate the public, not in terms of the science necessarily, but to make them aware that we are gone down a wrong route. And I think we economists have a lot to answer for. And the review is quite explicit about. Periodically, I criticize my own profession. When I say economics, it's the practice of economics. Our subject is fantastic, amazing techniques we've got. But we really have made a mess of things by creating models of growth and development in which nature doesn't appear at all.
Well, with some exceptions, including you from the 70s, but yeah, not in the sort of granularity or in the mainstream, the main journals, the key journals. I think these points are well made. I'm going to move us to the Q&A. This is, Partha, we've been running these events for a while at the Oxford Martin School, many of them. I haven't been in an event where I've had 30 questions lined up at this stage. With an awful lot of commentary on many of the questions. The number one question, voted up 14 times from Cassandra, is about the shift away, notes the importance of shifting away from GDP. And she observes that there seems to be, in the review, a kind of call for a shift away from traditional capitalism without explicitly saying the C word, but she asks, what's the viable alternative? And is green growth, which is still growth, that's surely unsustainable in the long run, is her point. And others further down the list have asked similar questions on similar themes. We can't keep growing forever. So what is the model that is going to replace the model that we have currently? Now, of course, I may not necessarily agree with all of the premises in these questions, but they're very good questions.
Well, thank you very much. The chapter 4 star. The review has some star chapters, by the way, where I've kept the technical side of things, and of course there are technical side of things also boxes. But 4 star is the one which has the prototypical growth and development model of economic possibilities. I shouldn't use the word growth and development anymore. Economic possibilities, in which nature is absolutely central. If I want to describe it picturesquely, I would say is the human economy is embedded within nature in the way we live in our home. It covers us. So no matter what wonderful furniture you may have, how many lovely pieces of art you have, whatever possessions you have will be disturbed, will be useless if the roof falls apart, if the floor sinks, and so forth. So the model has that. And the other thing the model has, which really creates the limitations of economic growth as we know it, is the fact that it traces economic activity from source to sink. So it takes material balance very seriously, that all the waste we produce has to be then recycled, and the recycling is done by Mother Nature for the most part. And if you stretch that service too much, then other things get bad. So the idea that this is biodegradable, it's fine. It's not fine, because if the amount of biodegradable, the amount of refuse you throw into the system exceeds its capacity, then of course other things go wrong. So the model has that. Okay, what would it be? Suppose just you have a thought experiment where you've created an environment in which we have closed the gap between demand and supply, let's say, which is the minimum requirement for sustainable development, by the way. I mean, obviously that. Okay. Then what will the world look like? I don't know. And I think it'll be wrong to speculate, because the whole art of decentralized in the world we live in is that understanding the world we live in is we can't predict. People are going to respond. What we can do at best as an economist is to try and provide the environment in which people can choose, and choose well in in line with the common good. And here the common good simply is the simple stuff, which is reduce the impact inequality, and make that inequality and equality. Okay, so that's a very minimal requirement. What kind of technological change will take place, I don't know. All I do know is it won't be rapacious of nature, unlike the technological change that we have experienced over the past 200 years, largely because nature has been free. So entrepreneurs are they're not going to economize on nature. It's the cheapest thing on earth. So you go for technological change, new technologies, which are rapacious, which economize on the more expensive in factors of production. That will not happen in this world that we are imagining just now. Mm-hmm. So we don't know what kind of technology it will be, what kind of lifestyle we'll choose to have. But we'll also adapt, and we'll also invent ways of living, which are good for us, in a very different price structure. So that is, I think, at best we economists can do, rather than speculate as to whether this will mean growth must be zero, and my gosh, we don't, what will be there to look forward to. We just rechannel our activities in such a way that I'm sure we'll do the best we can until we'll discover new ways of doing things. And I don't think we can speculate on what they will be.
There is a thread through economics that goes back a long way, that you're part of this kind of golden thread from John Stuart Mill through to Keynes and the review, that without necessarily speculating on the details says that, and this is kind of another way of engaging with Cassandra's question, that we will need to get to a state where we are less obsessed about getting on and more focused on, I think, the art of living, perhaps was Mill's expression. Keynes in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren used different language. And your point, Partha, seems to me to be completely correct, that in such a world, whether we're still growing the value of goods and services that humans provide one another, will definitely be in a stationary state of material flows, where those flows are circularized, where the demands placed on nature for returning the resources that we take from the biosphere back to the biosphere are way lower, because we've designed the way in which we're using those resources in a completely different fashion. And for instance, the Oxford Martin School has a program on the future of plastics that's looking at the possibility of, taking a very limited palette of monomers that naturally return to nature once we're done with them. There's a big ask, and we're not there yet, so don't get too excited. But I think that has to be the vision, and I guess perhaps we're agnostic, in the medium term, whether that means growth or not in the developed and rich countries. But what about this question of growth for the poorest? If you're in the bottom billion, you desperately want greater prosperity. How do we manage to deliver that? Because we want to, it's the right thing to do, and avoid the impact inequality getting more unequal?
Yeah, it's a very good question again. But think now of, I come back, I try and not give a direct answer for a good reason, because we want to go to the, if you like, the bottom of the barrel to see what's going on. And one of the things that the review points to is the fact that this mispricing of natural capital, not nature, but natural capital, has resulted in huge transfer of wealth from the poorest countries to the richest countries, because imports from there are underpriced. And since the imports from there are primary goods, I'm now talking in loose terms now, primary products, timber, and so forth. If they're underpriced because they're not priced adequately, below social cost in those countries, then of course that's wealth transfer. So we really, in the name of free trade or open trade, opening up of trade, we've actually done a huge disservice to the poorest countries. And again, this is it's not a story of exploitation, by the way. They didn't know, we didn't know, or at least people pretended they didn't know that there was a transfer going on because there was a wrong pricing mechanism. Okay, so Of course, they need help. Goes without saying, we want to raise their standard of living in terms of the provisioning goods like food and clothing, and that goes without saying. And that would mean that again, there's a temptation to say we have to give up things at our end. The point is, I just don't know how that imaginary world we were just discussing a few minutes ago, where we have closed the gap between the demand and supply, so that you have completely different pricing structure. It may happen it's not happening in one go, maybe in 10, 15 years or so, but if that happens even then, that world will be one where it's hard to know in advance what our living standard is going to be, but we do know their living standard of the poorest would be better because they won't be giving up their wealth in the way they're doing at the moment. Now, to be sure, we are giving them, there is aid going on. There is foreign aid. That's not to be discounted. But it is striking to me that we economists have sold the idea of globalization without asking the price structure under which globalization takes place. We really haven't. And I think, and the price structure that I'm concerned with, of course, is the price of natural capital.
Yeah, you've in part answered Jacqueline's question here about why not start with the rich, because actually we're the ones imposing the main resource burden on nature. And we often talk about, and the question I just asked you is, how do we manage to elevate the prosperity of the billion poorest? And you've given a good answer, I think, partly to Jacqueline's question as well. Actually, if we priced natural capital correctly, then that would go part of the way towards helping to lift those billion out of poverty. But there are, just to push the point a little bit further, I think Jacqueline probably is only partly happy with that answer. Are there not other things that we in the rich countries should be taking more seriously, should be doing more proactively to help on the one hand, elevate, lift up, increase the prosperity of the bottom billion, as Paul Collier would describe the billion poorest, and also protect our natural capital? Is the responsibility not with us?
Well, yeah, but one could also equally argue the responsibility is for the leaders of those countries, and they haven't been led all that brilliantly. And I think in polite society, we do not talk about the bad governments that exist in the poorest part of the world. But every time you pick up the newspaper, you find somebody who's been running the place for 50 years, 40 years. It's routine, and we gloss over it because you're not supposed to say that. But they are adults, and it's their societies. So it requires effort on both sides, no question about it. And I think but I think there was a part of your question had to do with green investment and green growth. Let's keep the growth side out of it, because we don't know what it is that we are looking at. It's not GDP, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. We're looking at wealth, wealth, inclusive wealth that includes natural capital as a stock. So we're talking about growth in that, possibly. And there, it seems to me that the weakness has been, the classical economists thought of a stationary state. You're quite right. As far as I know, I'm not an expert on the history of economic thought by any means, but as far as I know, they didn't have nature in it. Ricardo had land, but it was indestructible land, and of different grades, that's for sure. And they didn't have technological change. Okay.
Progress in the art of living, as I say, but perhaps, yes, perhaps not technological progress in the way that we would conceive of it. Yeah. Right.
Exactly. Absolutely. What we've taken away from that in the post-war models of growth and development has been the technological change in the sense that you just now pointed out, without removing their other error in not having nature in it. And that has skewed the discussion completely. Because every time you talk about natural capital, you say, well, there's technological progress. And that's what we use to belittle the early literature on the finite earth.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have the equipment to counter in the way I think you and I do. Hence the review.
Well, I would personally love to spend more time on this question. I think it's really vital, actually. Technological change isn't enough to solve the problem, but yes, it's certainly not sufficient. But some of it, I think, is necessary as well, for sure. I dare say you do too. That's another long discussion, and we're already running out of time. So I'm going to pick up the other top two for the moment. In terms of responsibility, responsibility lying with the rich world, in particular, it's a question from Andy here about the responsibility of the UK government in particular and Her Majesty's Treasury. So his question specifically is, do you think the Treasury will implement the recommendations of your review in full? And if not, can we do it ourselves? And of course, not all of your recommendations, indeed not even the majority of them, were for the Treasury itself. But all the same, I think you get the gist of the question.
Yes, of course. It's impossible for me to say, because at the moment, the Treasury is preparing a response. It's a part of the protocol, response to the review. And once that's prepared, we'll get a sense of how much they will be able to, they're willing to absorb, or feel they can absorb. But let's make it clear, many of the review recommendations are ones over which one country has very little leverage. So one of the recommendations that I'm really keen on is the creation, given that we have COP26, COP15 coming up, the establishment of an international transnational organization like the World Bank, IMF, which were created after the war. We have now another crisis situation, a really serious crisis. And if we could be magnanimous and imaginative enough to have create an institution which monitors and manages these open resources, the global commons, global public goods. After all, the World Bank and IMF were designed to produce public goods. Those were international public goods, global public goods, financial stability or development, as the case might be. So that's not something that the Treasury can command. No. Best, if it feels it's a good idea, maybe the government will suggest it and work towards it. But it's something that has to be agreed upon and accepted and enthusiastically by many countries. But the reason the recommendation has some attraction, at least even at the first cut, is that it could be revenue generating, because it would be charging. It would create a charge for using the open oceans, for example, for our transport, for fishing, and so forth. And we might be able to use some of it to subsidize those countries which are sitting on some of the biggest, largest global public goods, but they are within national jurisdiction, like the rainforests, tropical rainforests. Economics tells us that they ought to be compensated by the rest of us for protecting them. And of course, all this requires, this is beyond me to even imagine a discussion of that sort, but that's sort of logic drives you in that direction. So that kind of thing, the government can't do it much other than perhaps, hopefully they will think it's a good idea. Then there are many small things. For example, the suggestion that we move to a system of national accounts, which are like balance sheets. That's something I think will be accepted. My guess is we'll move in that direction. Many countries are moving in that direction.
That's right. Yeah.
What the review does is to really articulate it properly, theoretically. And there is a third, which is, I think it may well be that we'll find the greening of national income expenditure accounts in Treasury and other departments at the same time. One of the recommendations is that we shouldn't be only concerned, we shouldn't delegate only the Department of the Environment with this class of issues. Every project should be screened for its impact on nature. Pretty straightforward cost-benefit analysis. It's just that there's missing items, and the Treasury is as good a place to start that as in the Bank of England and so forth. So I can't say in advance, but there's a whole range of recommendations that we've made, and let's just see. I hope very much they'll find them to be attractive. Let me put it that way.
Wonderful. I can't resist saying that on the big one, on the new organization, I think there are a few people who are better equipped to talk to that one than Inger Andersen, of course, who leads the United Nations Environment Programme, who will be joining us next in this series on the Dasgupta Review on the 20th of May in 2 weeks' time. So, Partha, I will put that specific recommendation to Inger and see what she has to say. Those of you listening in can tune in on the 20th, and we'll continue a mediated discussion between Partha and Inger. On the accounts question, that leads me rather nicely, and I'm very conscious of time, but there is a heavily upvoted question here from Tim on this. I mean, it's a question you all know and love, Partha. If we're pricing things, how do we avoid just reducing nature to which is an irreplaceable source of life, correctly in Tim's words, into a set of tradable figures on balance sheets and income statements? And do we therefore need to just forget about this pricing and economics agenda because we're just mischaracterizing nature? Some people would even say it's that characterization of nature that is causing the problems in the first place.
Well, I should say that, in a brief period, I can't spell it out. The review is, I think, fairly explicit. When I talk in terms of the wealth estimate, it includes, there'll be lots of items for which there will be no prices placed. So then what happens? Well, you offer stock figures for the stock. So if you can't price wetlands, you will leave. Remember what we are studying. Let me come back to this, begin from the beginning. These wealth accounts are accounts which are showing you the change in wealth over time as you move from one year to another. Okay, so the absolute value of wealth doesn't have much of a meaning. It's comparisons which have a meaning. You're asking, are we leaving behind a country which is wealthier today than it was yesterday? Okay, that's what you're asking. It's a change you're measuring. All right. And you're saying, well, not everything can be priced. Fine. Those that are not, you provide quantity estimates. How much a forest cover? How, what's the state of the wetlands that we inherited last year? How are we leaving it this year? So the national accounts will have quantity statements, descriptive statements about the quality of the capital that we are leaving behind. Okay, so if there is a problem with valuing something, either because it's difficult or because you find it insulting to do it, insulting of nature to do it, never mind. Keep them as stock figures. Sacred groves, you don't price the sacred groves. You say, have we mismanaged the sacred groves this last year? Are they in a healthier state than they were before? Or are they in a worse state? And if in a worse state, what's going on? Why are we desecrating a sacred grove? Okay, let me put it that way to you. That's the way the account should be provided. In other words, the idea is that if you care about something, then display that care. And what we economists can do is to provide a grammar with which you can do that, to make a comparable set of statements so you know what the trade-offs are. Let me come back to something that I've been mentioning in my talks recently. In India, the Ganges is a holy river. I mean, it's about as holy as it can be. She's a goddess, okay? 500-600 million people live in the Gangetic Plain, Indo-Gangetic Plain, and it's one of the most polluted rivers on earth. Now, you've got a balancing act here. Needs and wants of poor people trump the fact that it's a holy river. And yet, of course, we have ways of trying to come to terms with these contradictions. If you ask, as I did once, a great scholar, how do you reconcile the fact that this is our holiest river and we treat it so badly? And he said, it doesn't matter. She doesn't mind. She can't be affected. She's a goddess. Now, that's a very good answer because in our lives, we have this kind of conflict all the time. Think of as you were growing up, I'm sure you neglected your parents sometimes. And that's about as holy a thing as you can be. And then what do you say? Well, I've been busy. They will understand why I didn't call. I used to do that routinely in my life when my parents were alive. And you feel awful about it, but there we are, because you have to live with it. So I think we ought not to become too precious about this matter. Nature matters to us for a variety of reasons. They are a means as well as they are an end. They are a source of our inner life even. Fine, account for that. Keep that in mind. But your records ought to have those thoughts in them. And that's what national accounts should be.
Yes. And we're not pretending for a minute that they capture the full values, religious values, spiritual values, all the other values of nature.
Keep a tab on them. That's the main thing.
That is a great place to end, I think, both on the potential of economics and of the limitations, fundamental, of economics to help deal with this problem. But I think we've made a very big step forwards with this beastly document. It's a fine achievement, a triumphant achievement. Thank you, Partha, for everything you've done for the profession on this review and for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure for me. I apologize to all of you, numbering well over 30 of you who asked questions that were not able to be answered. We clearly needed at least another hour with Partha. It's not that surprising, to be honest. But if you enjoyed this, do come along and join us on the 20th with Inger Anderson, the head of the United Nations Environment Programme, and then Professor Dame Henrietta Moore and Professor Sir Charles Godfrey, the director of the Oxford Martin School, will be in conversation on the 3rd of June, again in this series on the Dasgupta Review, on rethinking planetary prosperity. Are we measuring what we value?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I want to have the last word, if I may, which is, first of all, to say thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. I've known you since you were a graduate student, so I'm that. And the other thing I want to say to the audience is that, in a way, Cameron's being deceptive. He was on my advisory panel, so he's pretty responsible for the review. Okay. Thank you very much for all your help with that, Cameron.
It's my pleasure, Partha. Thank you.